I don't know how to explain what happened that night in a way that makes it sound real. I've told this story a handful of times to people I trust, and even then I can see it on their faces, that moment where they're not sure if they believe me. I don't blame them. If someone told me this, I probably wouldn't believe them either. But I was there. I felt it. And some things, once they happen to you, they just don't leave. I was staying at a small cabin about 40 minutes outside of Bukavu, in the eastern Congo. It wasn't much. Wooden walls, a metal roof that drummed like a snare drum when it rained, a single cot, a propane burner, and a window that faced the tree line. I wasn't there as a researcher or a ranger or anything official like that. I was just a man who'd needed to get away from everything for a while. A friend of a friend owned the land. He told me I could use the cabin for a few weeks, that it was quiet, that it would do me good. He wasn't wrong about the quiet. The jungle out there has a sound all its own, layered and alive in a way that's hard to describe unless you've heard it. Birds I couldn't name, insects that never seemed to sleep, and underneath all of it, this low, constant hum, like the forest itself is breathing. I'd been there about 9 days when it happened. It was early evening, that hour when the light starts going amber and the shadows under the trees get thick fast. I'd just eaten, something simple, rice and canned fish, and I was sitting near the window reading when I heard it, a sound on the porch. One step, heavy. The old boards groaned under it in a way they'd never groaned under me, and I'd walked that porch 100 times. I put the book down, told myself it was probably nothing. A branch falling, maybe. The wood settling in the cooling air. I'd heard all kinds of sounds out there at night and learned to talk myself down from most of them. Then it happened again. One more step. Same weight, same deliberate, measured placement. Not scurrying, not random. Whatever was out there was moving slowly, on purpose. I sat completely still. There was maybe 15 feet between me and the door. The window was to my left, but the angle was wrong. I couldn't see the porch from where I was sitting. I thought about the lamp, thought about whether turning it off would help or hurt. I didn't move. I just listened. My heart was doing something loud and unhelpful in my chest, and I remember very clearly thinking, just stay still, just wait, just listen. A third step, right outside the door now. I got up slowly, moved toward the door without making a sound or trying not to. The floorboards had their own opinions about that. When I got close enough, I put my hand on the door frame and leaned in, pressing my eye to the narrow gap between the door and the jamb where the wood had warped just enough to let in a sliver of the outside. What I saw stopped me cold. A shape, massive, dark, close enough that I could make out the texture of coarse black fur in the fading light. A gorilla, not a small one, a fully grown female, and I knew she was female because of what she was carrying. She was holding something against her chest with both arms, cradling it, the way you'd hold something fragile, something precious, and she was standing no more than 4 feet from my door. I pulled back, just one step. My mind was going through everything at once. Danger, escape route, don't run, don't make eye contact, don't make any sudden movement. Everything I half remembered from things I'd read or heard over the years, none of which felt remotely adequate for this moment. She could have weighed 300 pounds. She could have come through that door like it was cardboard if she'd wanted to. But she wasn't moving aggressively. That was the thing. She wasn't pacing, wasn't vocalizing loudly, wasn't doing any of the things I would have associated with a threat display. She was just standing there, waiting, which almost made it worse, because it meant she knew I was there. She wasn't approaching by accident. She had come here. She had walked up to this door, on this porch, and she was standing outside it like she had a reason. I made a decision that I still can't fully explain. I opened the door. Not wide, just enough. I pushed it open maybe a foot and stepped back immediately, giving her space, keeping my hands open at my sides, trying to make myself look as unthreatening as a 6-foot man in a small doorway can look to an animal that could end him without much effort. I didn't speak. I barely breathed. She didn't charge, didn't flinch. She looked at me, directly at me, with these dark, deep-set eyes that were completely calm, and then she did something I will never forget for the rest of my life. She shifted her arms, just slightly, adjusted the bundle she was holding so that it was angled toward me, not placing it down, not offering it in any way I had words for, just showing me. And that's when I saw the baby. It was small, much smaller than I'd realized, a young gorilla pressed against its mother's chest, and even in that fading light I could see that something was wrong. The little one wasn't clinging the way a healthy infant should. Its arms were loose, its head was resting heavily against the mother's forearm. It was alive. I could see the faint rise and fall of its chest, but it was barely holding on to that. The mother looked at me, then down at the baby, then back at me, and somewhere underneath all the fear, something shifted in my chest. Not a decision exactly, more like a recognition. She hadn't come here to threaten me. She hadn't come here by accident. She had carried her baby through the jungle to this door, to this light, to the only human presence for miles, because she was out of options. I took one slow step forward, hands still open, eyes low, trying to be as small as I could make myself feel. She didn't move. I took another step, and that's when it happened. Her head snapped to the side. Sharp, alert. Her whole body went rigid in an instant, and she turned toward the tree line, staring into the dark space between the trees with an intensity that turned my blood cold. From somewhere deep in the forest, a sound I couldn't identify drifted toward us. Low, distant, wrong in a way I couldn't put words to. Something was out there, and whatever it was, she was afraid of it too. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I want to tell you I knew what to do, that something instinctive took over and I just handled it. But that's not what happened. What happened is that I stood in that doorway with my heart slamming against my ribs, watching a 300-pound gorilla go completely still beside me, both of us staring into the same darkness, and I had absolutely no idea what came next. The sound from the forest didn't repeat. That almost made it worse. A sound that comes and goes can be explained away. A sound that stops and just hangs there in the silence. That one stays with you. The mother kept her eyes fixed on the tree line for what felt like a long time. Her breathing had changed. I could hear it now, low and controlled, like she was managing something. The baby made a small sound against her chest. Weak, almost nothing, and that small sound seemed to pull her attention back, because she turned her head slowly away from the trees and looked down at what she was holding. Then she looked at me. I took that as my cue. I don't know what else to call it. I stepped back into the cabin and left the door open. That's all I did. I didn't gesture, didn't make a sound. I just moved back and gave her the space and let her make the choice. I stood near the small table in the center of the room, hands at my sides, and I waited. The propane lamp was throwing a warm, unsteady light across the floor. Outside, the jungle had gone quieter than I'd heard it all week. Even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. She stepped inside. One foot crossed the threshold, then the other, and suddenly there was a gorilla standing in my cabin, and the room that had felt adequate for a grown man now felt very small. She had to lower her head slightly under the doorframe. She smelled of earth and wet leaves and something else underneath that I couldn't name, something animal and ancient. She moved to the center of the room and stopped, and for a moment she just stood there, taking it in. The lamp, the cot, the smell of the place, and I remember thinking she has never been inside a human space before. And yet here she is. That thought hit me harder than I expected. Whatever was happening out there in the forest had pushed her past every boundary her instincts would have told her to hold. I moved carefully to the cot and pulled the blanket off it, folded it twice, and laid it on the floor near the wall. Slow, no sudden movements. She watched every single thing I did. When I straightened up and stepped back, she looked at the blanket, then at me, then down at the baby. And then, with a kind of deliberateness that I still find extraordinary, she lowered herself and placed the infant on it. The moment her arms released that weight, you could see it move through her whole body. She didn't step back. She stayed right there, crouched over the baby, one hand resting lightly near its head, but she had placed it down. She had let it go into my space. I don't know how to explain how much that meant, except to say that I understood, in that moment, what it cost her. I knelt on the other side of the blanket, slowly, making myself low. I leaned in close enough to see the baby clearly for the first time, and what I saw tightened something in my throat. It was young, maybe a few months old, though I had no real way of knowing. Its fur was thin and dull where it should have been dense. Its eyes were half open, unfocused, drifting. Its breathing was shallow and too fast, with a faint catch at the top of each inhale that I recognized without being able to name. That sound a chest makes when something inside it is working too hard. There was a wound on its right side, not deep, but dark at the edges in a way that told me it had been there for more than a day. Maybe two, maybe longer. The skin around it was warm to the touch. Too warm. I sat back on my heels and tried to think. I am not a vet. I am not a doctor. I had a first aid kit in my pack, the kind you take camping, gauze and antiseptic and adhesive bandages, nothing serious. I had clean water and a way to heat it. I had the propane burner, and a small pot, and a headlamp and whatever else was in that cabin. That was the full inventory of what stood between this animal and whatever was happening inside its small body. And the mother was 18 inches away from me, watching my hands like she was reading every intention I had. I got the kit, came back the same way I'd left. Slow, low, quiet. I opened it on the floor beside the blanket and went through it without rushing. The mother leaned forward slightly when I uncapped the antiseptic. I stopped, waited. She settled. I kept going. I cleaned the wound as gently as I could. The baby flinched once, just a small pulling away, a tightening of its tiny limbs, and the mother made a sound low in her chest. Not a growl, something more complicated than that. a sound that sat right at the edge of warning without crossing over it. I kept my movements small and deliberate, talked quietly, not words exactly, just a low, even murmur, the kind of sound you make when you want something to know you mean no harm. I'm not sure who I was talking to, maybe both of them. I got the wound cleaned and covered as best I could. Then I filled the small pot with water and put it on the burner and soaked a piece of gauze in the warm water and laid it gently over the baby's chest. It was such a small thing to do, but the baby's breathing seemed to ease just slightly, and I stayed there watching it, willing it to keep going. Outside, the forest shifted, not dramatically, just a change in the texture of the night sounds, a gap where there had been continuity, a new quality to the silence. The mother heard it before I did. She was on her feet in an instant, moving to the door, filling the frame with her body, staring out into the dark. The rumble she made this time was different, deeper, directional, a sound aimed outward like a warning sent into the trees. I turned off the propane lamp. I don't know why, it just felt right. Reduce the light, reduce the signal, make the cabin less visible to whatever was out there moving through the dark. The room went dim, just the faint blue-gray of the jungle night coming through the window. The mother stayed in the doorway, I stayed by the baby, and the three of us just held that position together, listening. The sounds from outside grew more distinct, branches under weight, a low exchange of calls, muffled by distance but unmistakably intentional. Not rangers, not a patrol, something older than that, something that knew this forest the way she did. The mother turned back from the doorway and looked at me across the dark room. Then she looked at the baby on the blanket. Her breathing was audible now, slow and heavy, the way breathing gets when a body is managing something enormous. She looked at me again, and I understood with a certainty I can't explain, that we were almost out of time. I have replayed what happened next more times than I can count. In the middle of the night sometimes, when I wake up and the room is quiet, and my mind goes looking for something to hold on to, I go back to that cabin, that darkness, that small struggling breath, and every time I end up in the same place, just a man on his knees on a wooden floor, with no idea if what he was doing was enough, and no choice but to keep doing it anyway. The baby's breathing had changed. I noticed it the moment I turned back from watching the mother at the doorway. The rhythm was off, longer gaps between inhales, a kind of stuttering at the exhale, like the body was negotiating with itself over whether to continue. I moved to the blanket and leaned in close, close enough to feel the faint warmth coming off that small chest, and what I felt tightened everything in me at once. The fever had climbed. Even through the gauze, even in the cool of the cabin, the heat was unmistakable. This wasn't just a wound anymore. Something systemic was happening, something I had no tools to address and no training to understand, and the gap between what this animal needed and what I had to offer had never felt wider or more terrifying. I looked up at the mother. She was already moving toward me, not fast. Nothing she did was ever fast, which I'd come to understand was not slowness but control, a kind of absolute deliberateness that made every movement feel weighted with intention. She came to the edge of the blanket and lowered herself down beside the baby, and what she did next is something I have never been able to describe adequately to anyone. She touched it, just with the backs of her fingers trailing them lightly along the baby's side, the way you'd check on something you were afraid to disturb. And then she made a sound, so quiet I almost missed it, a low pulsing vocalization that wasn't distress exactly, but was close enough to it that it moved through me like a current. She was scared. That's the only word for it. Not the fear of threat or danger, but the particular fear of watching something you love slip away from you and not being able to stop it. I recognized it the way you recognize something you felt yourself, in your own life, in your own losses. It looked the same across every boundary between us. I turned back to the baby and made myself focus. I re-wetted the gauze and replaced it. Warmer this time. I checked the wound, no worse, at least. The cleaning had done something. I cupped my hands around the baby's chest, not pressing, just surrounding it with warmth, the way I'd once read you should do with a hypothermic animal. Just body heat, just presence. My hands were shaking. I noticed that and made a conscious decision to slow my breathing, because I knew on some level that the energy in that room mattered, that animals read the air around them, and if I was radiating panic then that was all she was receiving. So I breathed, slow and steady, and I talked. Low words, almost shapeless, not to the baby exactly, just into the space between us. It's all right, just breathe, just keep going, you're all right. The mother was so close I could have reached out and touched her without straightening my arm. She didn't flinch at my voice, she just stayed there beside her baby, close enough that the warmth of her body reached me, and I let myself believe that was helping too, that between the two of us, we were creating something, a pocket of warmth and stillness in the middle of all that jungle dark. The sounds outside had gotten closer. I could hear them clearly now, movement through underbrush, not careless but purposeful, circling rather than approaching directly. Whatever it was, there was more than one of them. The mother heard it too. Her head would turn toward the window at intervals, ears shifting, nostrils flaring, and each time she turned back to the baby, I could see the cost of that divided attention on her, the tension that ran along her jaw, the slight compression of her brow. She was holding two things at once that couldn't both be held, and she was doing it without breaking. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Time in moments like that doesn't move the way it normally does. It stretches and compresses in ways that make it useless as a measure of anything. And then a breath, not the stuttering, negotiated kind from before, a real one, full and clean, the chest rising properly and falling properly, the rhythm finding itself again like a signal that had been lost and suddenly came back through. The baby's eyes opened, not wide, just a sliver, just enough, and one small hand moved, curled slightly, reached for nothing and found the air and held onto it anyway. I sat back. I hadn't realized how far forward I'd been leaning until I moved away from it. My back ached. My hands were still trembling slightly. I pressed them flat against my thighs and just sat there in the dark and breathed, and for a long moment I didn't trust myself to do anything else. The mother leaned in immediately. She pressed her face close to the baby's face, exhaling slowly across it, that same trailing touch with the backs of her fingers, but different now, something released in it. She made the quiet sound again, but this time it had a different quality. Still low. What was left was something that had no clean name in any language I know, but that any parent in the world would recognize without needing one. I felt something move through my chest that I wasn't prepared for. I'd been holding myself so tightly together for the past hour, or 2 hours, or 3. I genuinely don't know that when it released it came out wrong. Not as tears exactly, just as this long, unsteady exhale that I had to turn away from her to finish. I pressed the back of my wrist against my mouth and looked at the ceiling and just held it there until it passed. The cabin was quiet around me. The lamp was still off. The jungle outside had settled into something less urgent, the sounds from the trees growing intermittent, then sparse, then gone. Whatever had been out there had moved on, or it had decided we weren't worth the trouble. Either way, the pressure of it lifted, and I became aware of how cold the air had gotten, and how still everything was, and how the only sound left in the room was the breathing of a baby gorilla that had, by some combination of luck and warmth and stubbornness, decided to keep going. I started to stand, slowly, stiffly, bracing one hand on the floor to push myself up. The mother watched me rise. She didn't tense, didn't shift position. She just tracked me with those calm, dark eyes as I straightened up and took a single step back, giving them the space, letting her know that the next move was hers. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked down at the baby. She gathered it against her chest with both arms, standing in a single fluid motion that made no sound at all, and I was struck again by that particular quality she had, that absolute command of her own body. Nothing wasted, nothing uncertain. The baby settled against her. One small hand found the dense fur at her shoulder, and gripped it weakly, but it gripped. I stepped back to the wall, gave her the full width of the room. She moved toward the door, slowly, paused at the threshold, 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and stood there for a moment in the open air with the jungle spread out behind her, and the dark between the trees and whatever waited for her out there in all of it. And then she looked back at me, just once, for just a moment, steady and unhurried, the way she did everything. I don't know what she saw. I know what I felt, which was something enormous and quiet, settling over me like a hand on the shoulder, the kind of thing that doesn't ask you to understand it, only to receive it. Then she turned, and she walked into the dark. The cabin felt different after she left. I don't mean that in any dramatic way. I just mean that a space holds the energy of what happened inside it, at least for a while, and that cabin held a lot. I stood at the open door for a few minutes after she disappeared into the trees, listening to the jungle close back around her, the sounds filling in again, the insects resuming, the night reassembling itself as though nothing had interrupted it. As though a gorilla hadn't just walked into a man's home and changed something in him that he wouldn't fully understand for a long time. I closed the door eventually, turned the lamp back on, looked at the blanket on the floor with its damp gauze and the small impression where the baby had lain, and I stood there in the yellow light feeling hollowed out in the way you feel after something takes everything you have and then simply ends. I wasn't sad exactly. I wasn't relieved exactly. I was something that doesn't have a clean name, wrung out and full at the same time, emptied and oddly heavy, like a cup that had been drained and was still somehow brimming. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay on the cot and stared at the metal roof and listened to the jungle and thought about the baby's breathing, the way it had faltered and then found itself again, that single full inhale that had cut right through me. I thought about the mother's face when she heard it change. I thought about what it means to carry something you love into the only place left to go, and to trust that what you find there will be enough. I thought about that for a long time in the dark, and somewhere in the thinking I must have finally gone under, because the next thing I knew, light was coming through the window, and the birds were going, and the propane burner was cold, and I was still wearing my boots. The days after that were quiet in the way that days are quiet when your mind is somewhere else. I went through the motions of being there, cooking, reading, walking the perimeter of the property in the mornings the way I'd gotten into the habit of doing. But I was listening differently now. Every sound from the tree line, every shift in the undergrowth, I'd stop and turn toward it. I told myself I wasn't waiting for anything. I told myself she was gone, that she'd taken her baby back into the forest, that that was exactly what was supposed to happen, and that the story was over. I almost believed it. 4 days passed, then 5, then 6. On the 7th morning I woke up early, before the light had fully arrived, and I lay there in that half-dark listening to the jungle settle into the day. There was something different in the sound. Not wrong, nothing alarming, just a particular quality of stillness in one direction, the kind that isn't empty but occupied, the kind that means something is there, choosing not to make noise. I got up slowly, pulled on my jacket against the morning cool, walked to the door and opened it without hurrying, the way you approach something you don't want to frighten away. She was at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the porch, standing at the place where the cleared ground around the cabin met the first line of trees, just inside the shadow, still, watching the cabin the way she'd watched it that first evening, with that complete, unhurried attention that I'd come to understand was simply how she moved through the world. Nothing urgent, nothing aggressive, just present, and beside her, standing on its own 4 limbs on the forest floor, was the baby. I stayed in the doorway. I didn't move toward them. I wasn't sure I could have moved even if I'd wanted to. There was something about that image, the two of them at the tree line in the early light, that stopped everything in me. The baby was upright, not fully steady. It swayed slightly, shifted its weight, reached out once to touch its mother's leg for balance, but it was standing. It was there. 7 days ago it had been lying limp on a blanket on my floor with a fever climbing, and its breathing going wrong. And here it was, standing in the morning light at the edge of a jungle, alive. The baby looked at the cabin, looked at me in the doorway. Then it did something that I was completely unprepared for. It took a few steps forward, just 3 or 4, out of the shadow and into the open ground, moving on all 4 limbs with that slightly unsteady, exploratory confidence that young animals have when the world is still new enough to be interesting rather than frightening. It stopped and looked at me again. Its eyes were clear, alert, full of something that in a human child you'd call curiosity without hesitating. I crouched down slowly in the doorway. We looked at each other across that open ground, this tiny gorilla and this man, and I don't know how long it lasted. Long enough for something to pass between us that I won't try to name because every word I reach for feels too small for it. Then the mother made a sound, just one, low and brief, and the baby turned immediately, the way young things turn when they hear the voice that means safety, and it went back to her. She gathered it against her side, not fully lifting it, just settling it there, and she looked at me one last time across that stretch of open ground. Her face was calm, completely calm, the way it had been that first night when she'd stood at my door in the fading light and shown me what she was carrying, that same steadiness, that same quality of knowing exactly what she was doing and why. She turned and walked into the forest. The trees took them in a matter of seconds. One moment they were there, and then the undergrowth shifted and the shadows rearranged themselves and they were simply gone, back into everything that had made them, back into the life that existed long before I arrived and would continue long after I left. The jungle closed behind them the way it always does, completely, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement that something had just passed through it that mattered. I stayed crouched in that doorway for a while after they were gone. The morning light was coming up properly now, going gold across the cleared ground, and the birds were loud and the air smelled of wet earth and green things, and I was aware of my own breathing in a way I rarely am. Just the simple fact of it, the in and the out, the body continuing without being asked. I've thought a lot in the years since about what to make of that night. I'm not someone who reaches for big explanations easily. I don't tend to wrap things up in language that makes them sound more certain than they are, but here is what I keep coming back to, the thing that feels truest when I sit quietly with it. She didn't come to me because I was capable. She came because I was there, and because she had run out of everywhere else to go, and because something in her, something old and layered and far beyond what I'll ever fully understand, told her to try. And what I gave her wasn't expertise or knowledge or any particular skill. It was just presence, warmth, a willingness to stay in the room with something frightening and uncertain and not run from it. I've needed that myself in my life. Most of us have. That one person or that one moment where something simply stays. I left the cabin 3 days later, drove back to Bukavu, flew home, went back to being whoever I was before all of that. But I'll tell you honestly, I've never fully come back from that forest. Part of me is still in that cabin, kneeling on that floor, listening to a small chest remember how to breathe, and I think that part of me will stay there for good. Some things you don't get over, you just get bigger around them. And sometimes if you're very still and very lucky, the wild world shows you something it doesn't show many people, not because you earned it, not because you were ready for it, but simply because you were standing at the right door when something that needed help had nowhere else to go. I think about the baby sometimes, wonder where it is now, whether it's grown, whether it carries anything from that night, the way I do, some faint trace of warmth, some cellular memory of hands that meant no harm. I don't know, I'll never know. That's part of it too. But I know it's out there, moving through that forest, alive, and some mornings when the light is right and the world is quiet, that's enough.